I am delighted to welcome Alex Newman. Alex is an independent journalist whose work appears in several publications, including the New American Magazine. He's lived in several countries. He speaks 7 languages. I can barely manage English. And he travels the world reporting on issues such as the climate change hoax, deep state, and more recently, the corona crisis hoax. Today, he's going to enlighten us on the failures of public education and the bizarre things that are going on in schools around the country, and some of what he tells you is going to curl your hair. He co-authored, along with the late, great Samuel Blumenfeld, an expert in phonics, this book, Crimes of the Educators, subtitle, How Utopians Are Using Government Schools to Destroy America's Children. His website, Alex's website, is libertysentinel.org. Alex, so nice to have you here, and it's such an honor to be able to interview you.
Hey,
nice
it's great to be here, Ivan. Hey, thank you so much for having me, Ivan. It's an honor to be here, and I really appreciate it. So,
how are things in the Sunshine State?
About as good as they can be. You know, I know our governor's pretty decent compared to others with all this corona craziness, and the rioting hasn't been as bad as it has been in Democrat states, so can't complain.
I want you to start, please, by going ahead and telling us some of the horror stories of what's happening in public schools. And I want you to begin with the saga of Leatherman.
Yeah, Ed, this Leatherman incident was one of the recent ones that we reported on over at Freedom Project Media. And so they have, in elementary school, they have a librarian. His name, I think, was Roger Grape. And when he's not at school, he doubles as Leatherman. He's part of this weird homosexual sex club where they whip each other and do stuff like that. And one of his buddies, they wanted to do an LGBT, reading thing for the little children, drag queen event like they've been doing at schools around the country. And so Mr. Grape, aka Leatherman, invited his drag queen buddy, who turns out was a convicted sex offender, had been involved in male prostitution and other things. And so he had pled nolo contendere, which is kind of like, yeah, I'm guilty, but hey, can we please settle this in a better way than going to trial? And so that was the loophole that allowed Mr. Grape to bring him in to dress up as a woman and read these really grotesque LGBT stories to children, encouraging them to become transgenders, to be their true selves, encouraging sexualization. And by the way, this was in Texas, I should mention. There's such a myth out there. I think a lot of conservatives try to tell themselves this because they don't want to feel guilty about sending their children to school. Say, oh, well, I live in a conservative state. I live in a conservative district, and Aunt Mary works in the school, so it can't be that bad. Oh, no, it's that bad. It's happening all over the country, even in the most conservative states and districts. And Leatherman is just one example among many, many, many that are happening all over the place. So,
and of course, Leatherman goes to these clubs, these bars where they're only men and wearing their skimpy leather outfits, and they engage in activity that we really don't need to talk about. Yep. Just these poor people are sick and disturbed. Isn't that correct?
It is, yeah. And of course, they have access to all our children now. It'd be one thing if they were sick and disturbed and, hanging out in their closet or in their bedroom away from our children. But no, they want to drag our children into this. And they are actively recruiting. Make no mistake, these drag queen story hour things, these aren't about teaching the children tolerance. In fact, these people are so intolerant. I have experience with how intolerant they are. They brought a drag queen into a middle school in Colorado, the Rocky Top Middle School. The drag queen's name was Jessica Lahore. And so this guy dresses up in a skimpy woman outfit and comes and he tells the children, hey, you can grow up and be a drag queen like me, right? Make a career out of it. And I wrote an article about this, and it wasn't particularly offensive. I just said, it wasn't clear if they also brought in some prostitutes and strippers and, maybe some bank robbers for good measure. And this drag queen, Jessica Lahore, rounded up this whole mob of LGBT activists, and they start bombarding me with hate mail, and they start bombarding my Facebook with these posts. And I actually saved a lot of them because, in the name of tolerance, they said, you should die, you should go kill yourself, you're so intolerant, how dare you exist on this planet. And so what they really mean by promoting tolerance is promoting seething, vile, vicious hatred of anyone who stands in the way of their recruiting efforts to gather our children together into their LGBT pride parade. So
In other words, whatever we want to do is perfectly okay.
that's right.
Let us do, no matter how much you may dislike it or how disgusting and immoral it is. We
That's
have a
right.
right to do it.
With your children. And, this is happening. I mean, in California, we just wrote an article a few weeks ago, a mother, now with the whole coronavirus thing, the schools got shut down. And so a lot of the so-called learning, and I would really contest the use of the term learning to describe what's happening in public schools today, unless we mean learning perversion and filth and indoctrination. But they had sent an email to this middle school child. I believe he was 13 years old, and it was an invitation to a private, invitation only LGBTQ queer plus hangout for youth. And then as you go down further in the email, they define youth as children all the way up to adult homosexuals and transgender. You could be a 25-year-old cross-dressing pedophile, and you could come into this LGBT thing and start interacting with little children. And this was officially endorsed by the school, right? The school is the one who sent out the email, and they're like, we're not endorsing this, but here, have the email. You should go hang out in this private LGBTQ web hangout. So the mom naturally, freaked out and said, my child is never going back to the school again. Praise God for that. But this is happening. I mean, they are actively trying to bring children into this wickedness.
So tell us something about the dangers of Common Core, and tell us about the monster named David Coleman, because I doubt the average person knows who David Coleman is. Please tell us about him.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. So Common Core is the national education program implemented by Barack Hussein Obama and his sidekick, U.S. Education Secretary Arne Duncan. And obviously, Bill Gates played a big, big role in this. He put about $2 billion of his own money in it. And by the way, this was just a few years after he signed a deal with UNESCO, the communist-controlled UN Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. And this deal that he signed with UNESCO was to create global standards, global curricula, global training programs, so that all the teachers would be brainwashed with the same program, so they could go out and brainwash all the children with the same idiocy. And so Gates signed this agreement. And by the way, UNESCO has a world core curriculum that they say they want taught in every school in the world. And we can go into that later too. That's enough to make your head spin. But so Bill Gates comes back to America and right away gets working on this Common Core thing. He put $2.3 billion into it. And he got a couple of organizations involved. The main one that led the process was one called Achieve Inc. Now, this is run by members of the Council on Foreign Relations, Bilderberg attendees, and they put together these terrible standards. And when I say terrible, don't take my word for it. They had two subject matter experts, and only two, on the Common Core Validation Committee. These were hand-picked people that were in charge of deciding whether Common Core was suitable for children. And they said, Common Core, this is the two subject matter experts. They said, this is so absolutely terrible, we refuse to sign off. The English expert, her name is Dr. Sandra Stotsky. I know her, and we disagree on some pretty significant things. She's okay with the existence of national standards, for example, as long as the national standards are okay. But she said, no, these are an atrocity. You're taking out all the great literature of Western civilization for the last 2,000 years. You're replacing it with like Obama's executive orders, EPA regulations on roof insulation, right? And so the kids are supposed to get excited about reading EPA regulations on roof insulation. Of course, they're not, right? So she refused to sign off. Then you had the only mathematics, and she also said specifically, I interviewed her for some of my articles, and we served on some boards together. She said, these are going to reduce the critical thinking ability of children. And I don't know whether she understands this, but of course that was deliberate, right? The reason they're going to reduce the thinking skills of children is because that was the plan all along. Then the math expert, a gentleman by the name of James Milgram, Stanford University mathematician, very, very smart mathematician. And he also refused to sign off on the standards, and he wrote this blistering critique. I mean, you almost can't believe it when you're reading it. He just tears into the thing, and it says, it's as non-challenging as possible. It's ridiculous. He says if children are exposed to this for 3 years, all hope is gone. They're never going to be able to do math. He says there's actual errors in the math, right? And he points to real mathematical errors in the standards all the way through middle school And so he also refused to sign off. The only two experts that were handpicked to tell us how great this was refused to sign off. Now the federal government knows how bad they are. They've funded some studies to see what was happening. They funded a study by an organization called CSAIL. I forget what the acronym stands for. I think it's the Center for Standards Alignment, something. And they found that children are getting significantly dumber as a result of Common Core in math and in English, and that these results get worse and worse as time goes on. In other words, we still haven't even hit the bottom yet. We're still on the way down as a result of this. And of course, this was rolled out nationwide. I also was able to interview one of the leading officials who was involved in the writing of the reading standards, the early reading standards for kindergarten, first grade, second grade. Very nice lady. Again, progressive. We wouldn't agree on much, but we do agree that there's one way to teach reading. You got to teach children what sound the letters make so that they can decipher and join the letters together and decipher what's written on the page. Well, that's what she wrote into the program. They ended up taking it all out and replacing it with what's known as the whole word method of teaching reading. They've literally got kindergarten children memorizing entire words. And she said, this is not how children learn how to read. Anybody who's reviewed the scientific literature knows that this is not how children learn how to read. In fact, we've known since 1844 that this is quackery, when all the schoolmasters in Boston rose up in unison and said, this isn't working. We're not going to do it anymore. And yet they enforce it under Common Core. It has led to incredible reading problems. And here we are. We are dumber as a nation than we've ever been before, and we are still falling down the cliff. And who knows when we'll hit the bottom, but it's coming. So
now some of those children have grown up and are out looting Target stores.
That's right. That's exactly right. You want an explanation for why our society is falling apart around us? Look no further than the public school system. These poor children have been taught to hate the United States. They don't know anything about the Constitution. They don't know anything about our history. They know everything about gender theories and climate change baloney, but nothing about what matters. And that's why they're ready to destroy our nation. So,
okay. Well, we didn't talk about David Coleman. So tell us.
Oh, yes. Sorry. So David Coleman
Coleman
was one of the architects of Common Core, and now he has actually moved over to the College Board, which is the organization that is responsible for the SAT, which, all across America, children take the SAT to be able to get into college. And historically, a child could completely opt out of the system, right? He could be homeschooled, she could be homeschooled by their parents, and then they would blow away the government school kids on the SAT because, they're better at everything typically. And then the colleges would be, scrambling and fighting with each other to try to attract these children, these students. And what has happened now is David Coleman, the architect of this abomination, has now aligned the SAT. They've also now aligned the ACT, the other standardized test to get into college, with the Common Core, so that children who are homeschooled who don't use the Common Core will be at a unique disadvantage. Now, I suspect homeschool children will still do better than the victims of public school, but they've really tried to align the SAT through David Coleman as much as possible with the idiocy happening in Common Core to give kind of an advantage, a leg up to the poor children who've been victimized by this hoax.
And Coleman, I've seen there are videos of Coleman on YouTube, and he has speaking to a group of teachers, he said, you need to understand that if I ask you to do something, I have no higher power.
Yep.
And
yeah, they all have this attitude, this kind of messianic complex where they see themselves as, gods bestriding the earth. And really, this has been the educational philosophy of the school system. It was actually made the established religion of the United States, I would argue, back in 1962, 1963, when the Supreme Court unconstitutionally ruled that we couldn't have prayer and Bibles in the schools. As Justice Potter Stewart put it, he was one of the dissenting justices in these rulings. He said, this didn't create a state of neutrality with respect to religion. What you guys just did was establish the religion. He called it secularism. I would call it humanism, because it really was the religion of John Dewey. He was the author, one of the co-authors of the Humanist Manifesto. And, we know what the religion, at least John Dewey was honest enough to call it a religion. He described himself as a religious humanist. And the first plank of his manifesto was, we believe the universe is self-existing and not created. right? So there is no God. It's an attack on the very first words of the Bible. And then as you keep reading through, you realize it's really just communism, socialism repackaged as a religion. We got to get rid of the profit motive. We have to have collective ownership of the means of production. We've got to unite humanity in this wonderful brotherhood of man, this world governing system they're trying to build. This is a dangerous false religion that treats mankind as little gods, right? I get to decide what's right and wrong, and the school system will help mold us into, the kind of humanist model citizens that John Dewey would have imagined. It's very, very dangerous. And again, you don't have to take my word for it. Just look around you. Look at the fruit of this school system. Go talk to some young people today. The polling data is crystal clear. My generation, the millennials, Evan's generation, 70% of millennials now describe themselves as socialists. Over half now specifically reject Christianity. For the first time in American history, we have a generation coming up that is majority non-Christian. And this is a complete direct result of the indoctrination taking place in government schools.
Coleman also says that teachers will teach to the Common Core test, and there is no power on earth to stop that.
That's right. That's right.
I get, from watching videos of him, I get the sense he is into data collecting, because he says, think of what you can do with all this data.
Yeah, well, that's another big component of it. Common Core is not just the set of standards. It's also this broader system, which involves enormous amounts of data collection. And that's one of the reasons why Gates was so interested in this. He's going to stand to make a fortune through his shares in Microsoft, because Microsoft and of course, the other big technology companies are getting these contracts. But the data that the federal government is mining through Common Core and through the new technologies that they're bringing into the school system, we have the reports from the U.S. Department of Education. I mean, I can show them to people. They have now unleashed what they call facial expression cameras. And so your child will be sitting at the desk, and this camera will be monitoring his facial expressions to determine what kind of response he has to various different stimuli. So, hypothetically, maybe Mr. Leatherman comes in, or his drag queen buddy, to read some LGBT stories to the children. And the facial expression camera recognizes that your child made a face. Like, oh, why is that in my classroom, right? And they say, aha, we need to schedule an intervention for this one. He must come from one of those nutty Christian families that aren't tolerant of, perversion. We got to do something here. And so this is all going into there. And they actually tell you in these Department of Education reports that one of the things they're going to do with all this data is predict the future values, behaviors, beliefs, and ideas of your child. And so they're going to use this all for central planning. They're going to say, oh, well, your children are extra strong in, I don't know, math or something, so we'll put them in this track. Or your children are conservative, or they're Christian, or they don't agree with the New World Order. We're going to put them on this track, and they can dig ditches or something. Not that there's anything wrong with digging ditches, but we definitely aren't going to let them be lawyers or professors or anything like that. So it's a very, very dangerous future we're heading into, and Common Core is a crucial part of it.
Get everybody thinking just alike.
One size fits all. And I wouldn't even call this education anymore. I mean, it's really animal training, really. And it has been for quite some time. These people have 100 years of psychological and behavioral research behind them that allows them to really condition children. It's really not so much education anymore as it is like the way you would train a circus animal to perform on cue. That's what we're seeing now. They want the children to have the desired response to a given stimuli. So they think about illegal immigration, and they're supposed to think, oh, that's good. They think about borders. They're supposed to think, oh, that's evil. That's racist. We have to get rid of borders. It's just conditioning them to have the desired response. They even have names for this stuff. They call it social and emotional learning. Right, we're moving away from academics. We're telling children what attitudes and values and beliefs they ought to have. And trust me, they're not Christian. They're not patriotic. They have nothing to do with traditional America. It's very, very dangerous stuff.
What I'm seeing is there's basically two things being taught: sex and social activism, and not only in schools, but especially in colleges.
Yep, that's right. And when you read the standards, you see that come through very clearly, right? They do not teach academics anymore. They don't even teach reading properly. So they're actually depriving these children of being able to access that information in the future. Maybe hypothetically, one of them wakes up when they're 14 or 15 and says, all I've heard is that these founding fathers were such horrible human beings. Let's go read what they wrote, right? They're going to be incapable of doing that because they haven't been taught to read properly. Instead, you can take a look, for example, at the next generation science standards, which were developed by the same people who developed Common Core. People would be amazed. You'll never learn the term scientific method, right? When I was a kid, we learned about the scientific method over and over and over again. That's kind of like the foundation of science, right? Is you want to be able to use the scientific method to determine, the truth and to do experiments and things like that. Well, in 12 years, these children will never hear that term. Instead, almost every year, they'll be bombarded with this propaganda that they came from slime, that turned into a fish, that turned into a monkey over billions of years, and there is no God, and that this is supposedly science. And they'll be bombarded with this propaganda that man's activities, everything basically, because we even exhale CO2, is causing this crisis in climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it. They've changed the term quite a few times, and that humans are responsible, and the only answer is to allow the UN to tax and regulate this. So they are brainwashing the children to have the ideas that will facilitate the destruction of the United States of America and the imposition of a global, technocratic, socialistic, planetary regime, as John Holdren, Obama's science czar, famously put it.
Oh, yes. Give us, history is important. Give us a brief history on Horace Mann and John Dewey. And John Dewey, of course, is famous for saying, "I can't make good socialists out of children who can think for themselves."
Yeah, so Horace Mann was one of the, I would say he really was the first man to really bring about government control of education in America. A lot of people look at the Puritans, of old Massachusetts, and they set up like some town schools, and like that's the origin of public school. No, nothing could be further from the truth. That was a completely different thing. That was just townspeople getting together and, hey, let's hire one of us to teach the children. It was a small community, very homogeneous. No, state government control, no bureaucracy, just, one teacher for a town to help teach the children to read and do other things. The real genesis of government school in America came from Horace Mann in the late 1830s. He was selected to serve as the first ever Secretary of Education for one of our states, or in his case, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And what he did was he set about on this program of fundamentally reforming the education system. Up until that time, you basically had mostly private schools, church schools, things like that. And then some of these towns still had what they called common schools. Horace Mann rejected this idea completely and brought in state control over the schools. So he wanted to demonize private schools and eventually shut them down and suck all education under the control of the state. He actually brought in what was called the Prussian model. So the Prussians had taken this idea from a communist, Robert Owen, who had actually set up a failed communist commune in Indiana called New Harmony. And the Prussians really liked the idea, the Prussian dictator, so they implemented that in Prussia. Basically, the first example ever of statist education of the state, by the state, for the state. Horace Mann loved that, brought it over to Massachusetts and implemented that there. One of the big parts of his program was to have the government train all the teachers. So he set up what he called these normal schools, where they were going to be training the teachers. And right off the bat, they were training the teachers with quackery, right? One of Horace Mann's big passions was phrenology, this stupid idea that depending on the size of your brain and your skull, it's going to have a difference in your personality. And so right off the bat, as soon as government was taking over education, they started promoting quackery. Same thing with the reading. Horace Mann had taken this idea of the whole word method, which had actually been developed by Christian people who were taking care of deaf and mute children. It was a good idea for them because they couldn't hear sounds. And so, you teach them another way, teach them to memorize whole words. And if they're smart, maybe they can memorize a few thousand and they can make sense of what's on a page, right? But Horace Mann took this idea and said, hey, let's try it in the schools for non-deaf children and see what happens. Well, it was an incredibly failed experiment. It only took a few years for all the schoolmasters in Boston to say this quackery is ridiculous. We're not going to use it anymore. So right off the bat, when government took over school systems under Horace Mann, the quackery began in earnest. It wouldn't have happened in the private sector. It wouldn't have happened in a free market because parents wouldn't send their children to a school that was teaching quackery. And yet when the government began to control it, it suddenly became easy. So after Horace Mann had finished wreaking havoc in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, he went around the country like an evangelist, preaching this message of that the government ought to control education. We ought to have mandatory attendance laws. Government should control the children. Government should compel parents to send their children to these brainwash camps. And I mean, it was an atrocity. And by the early 1900s, John Dewey had come on the scene. In fact, John Dewey had come on in the late 1800s, kind of picked up where Horace Mann had left off, and took this architecture that had been left by Horace Mann and his disciples, this government takeover of education, and really like put the pedal to the metal, right? Started fundamentally transforming even that, moving it away from any semblance of traditional education. He actually got funding from the Rockefellers. He wrote this essay where he admitted we're going to have to do this quietly because if parents and teachers figure out, he said there was going to be a revolution, right, that would jeopardize the final success of his endeavor. But with money, excuse me, with money from the Rockefellers, he set up this experimental school at the University of Chicago, funded by the Rockefellers, again, $3 million, and graduated a bunch of kids who couldn't read, couldn't write, couldn't tell right from wrong. I mean, just total embarrassment. And they decided that this would be good for the entire nation. So they set about taking control of the country. They resurrected this whole word quackery that Horace Mann had brought in. And, Horace Mann got his ideas from Prussia. We know where John Dewey got his ideas from. He went to the Soviet Union, okay? And he wrote these articles in this communist magazine called The New Republic, which is still around today, by the way. And oh, it's so wonderful here. It's like a utopia. And, the schools are instilling a collectivistic mentality in the children. Isn't this beautiful? Isn't this wonderful? And, by the time 1950s came around, the takeover was really complete. In the 1960s, the Supreme Court gave the final death blow to what remained of Christian traditional education. They said no more Bibles, no more prayer. We're officially going to establish John Dewey's religion as the national religion of the United States. All parents will be compelled to support it with their taxes. Parents will be compelled to subject their children to 12 years of indoctrination into this new religion. And, the rest is history. I mean, now Americans have completely forgotten who they were. I mean, we have no idea, the average American, what we were as a people, what our Constitution says, what our Declaration of Independence says. And so these were probably the two most important people in that process. And you can talk to any educator today, anybody who's got an education degree from any education college in this country, that say, oh, yeah, John Dewey, he was the founding father of this marvelous public education system we have. Like, yeah, well, he was the founding father, but if only you knew what existed before. So,
yeah, and I said earlier there are things going on in public schools that would corrode your hair. We have one thing. I know years ago, a young teenage girl, her school took her off to get an abortion without her parents' knowledge or consent. Just recently, we had a young teenage boy the school took him out to have sex change surgery. They've been handing out condoms and birth control in schools for years now. They now want boys and girls to use the same restroom. Can you tell us some more horror stories?
Yeah, well, I mean, really, the government has taken over the role of parent, and they've admitted that they're doing this. In fact, during Obama, they put out a document at the U.S. Department of Education where they said, we'll let parents be equal partners with us in the raising of their children, but we do need to have home visits, right? We need to go check on all the parents. We do need to make sure the parents are raising those children the way we want them raised, and giving them the medicines we want to give them, and teaching them the way we want them taught, and all the rest of it. And they've taken that very seriously. I mean, you gave, I think, a really important example. We had a case in Minnesota where a minor boy decided that he was actually a girl. And, he talked to mom, hey, mom, can I have a sex change? No, son, that's crazy talk. Get on the school bus, please. And this other partner, the government said, well, we know better than that silly parent. They're discriminating against their poor transgender son. So they actually took this child to a medical facility. And I would never call one of these quacks who are mutilating the genitals of little children a doctor. They're not doctors. They're quacks. But they took this child to a medical facility to be mutilated. I mean, they literally removed this child's genitals and put him on all kinds of drugs, hormones, puberty blockers, narcotics to deal with the pain of, being surgically mutilated like that. And now there's a federal lawsuit about it, but guess what? That ship has sailed. You can't do anything about that now, right? You can't reattach the pieces parts. That child is going to be sterilized and mutilated for the rest of his life. You have a situation in California now. I've actually downloaded the forms right from the government's website. They have a gender support plan and an individual transition plan. And so they ask the children to describe, what are your preferred pronouns? Are you hoping to become a woman or, a new gender or whatever? And if the answer is yes, okay, well, do your parents support you in this? If the answer is no, they say, all right, well, now we got to come up with a plan to hide this from your parents. Don't worry, the school's going to help you get what you need done. We'll help you get the drugs, the puberty blockers, the hormone injections, right? They're injecting little girls with testosterone, which of course leaves them sterile, helps them grow facial hair, deepens their voice. I mean, just horrible things that it does, irreversible things that it does to these little girls' bodies. And so they said, well, we're going to help you hide it from your parents. What name do you want us to call you when you're at school? And what name should we call you when your parents are in front of you? So they're deceiving parents. They're manipulating parents. They're training the children to believe that this is good, that this is acceptable. The data is just absolutely appalling. I mean, California now, you have 27% of 12 to 17-year-old children now saying that they're transgender, gender nonconforming, whatever. Boys who don't accept that they're boys, girls who don't accept that they're girls. I was in Utah a few months ago and had some meetings. I was doing a speaking tour on this education issue, and I had some meetings at the Capitol with some of their education officials, and they gave me some of the data. The number of transgender children in Utah, conservative Utah, right, one of the most conservative states in the union, the number of transgender children has increased 10,000% in 5 years. 10,000%. So this brainwashing is very, very effective. They are literally destroying these children. As you mentioned, they take children all the time now to go murder their babies without informing the parents, right? They never tell the parents. I mean, your grandchild could be having his brain sucked out, and you would never hear about it unless your child decided to reveal that to you. So, we have entered a brave new world where government now treats parents as pariahs and treats children as if the children belong to the government. It's grotesque, and it's going to keep getting worse as long as parents keep handing their children over to the government for education.
Not only that, they're pumping them full of medications. Their children are being diagnosed as ADD, ADHD, ABCD, XYZ. When I was in grade school, we didn't have any of that. I never knew any classmate that had to be given medication.
It's such a big problem, Ivan, and it's been going on for a long time now. Depending on what district you're in, it might be a fourth or a third of the children in that school are on hardcore psychotropic drugs. Now, if you were a drug dealer out on the street and you gave these same exact drugs to children, we're talking about amphetamines, we're talking about hardcore sedatives. If you were a drug dealer and you gave this to children, you would be thrown in prison for 30 years. But if you have a psychiatry degree, you can slap any kind of label you want on a child to give them any kind of drugs you want. And what's happening is these schools are dumbing down the children. The kids get frustrated. Why can't I read? Am I so stupid? I don't like this school. Please let me out of here. So they get frustrated. They act out. They say, oh, your child has some kind of disorder. Let's see. Let's look in our little book here. They call it the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's not even medicine, right? These people literally sit around and make up diseases and then vote on whether they should officially call it a disease. This is not like traditional medicine where you do an objective test and an x-ray or a blood sample. They say, oh, okay, well, you don't obey and you don't like school. Okay, we'll call that oppositional defiant disorder. And we're going to give you hardcore drugs that are going to turn you into a zombie. It'll be basically like a straitjacket for your brain. And hey, now you're behaving, right? Because you got drool coming out the side of your face and you can't think. Oh, well, at least you're sitting still in your chair, right? This is child abuse of the highest order, in my opinion. And it wouldn't be necessary if the children were having a decent education, right? If the kids weren't made to feel like idiots, if the kids weren't being told that they can pick any gender that they want and that they might have been born in the wrong body, if the kids weren't being told that their country is evil and their parents are evil and their church is evil, we wouldn't be having these kind of issues. And so we've seen this incredible plunge in American society. Think about the 1950s for those of you who are around, the 1960s. I mean, kids didn't shoot each other at school. Kids didn't hang themselves from their closets. Kids didn't cut their arms up. I mean, what in the world happened? It's the public school system, the deterioration in the public school system that happened.
Ritalin seems to be one of the most
That's
popular.
right. Hardcore amphetamines. I mean, this is literally a hardcore drug that you could buy from a street dealer, and that street dealer would go to jail for a very long time. You could buy the same thing at the pharmacy because some guy in a lab coat has said that you need it. So,
yeah. tell us quickly about what's going on in China, the way they're educating children there with mind control, literally mind control.
Yeah, and that's what's coming to the United States too. The communist Chinese can just pioneer it a little earlier because parents aren't in the habit of resisting things when their communist overlords tell them to do something, because then you end up in a concentration camp being re-educated, or maybe even having your organs harvested for leaders of the Communist Party. But so we just wrote an article about this recently at the Freedom Project. They've literally got these headbands that monitor the brain activity of the children and report to the teacher whether the child is paying attention, whether the child has been dozing off. They've got facial recognition cameras that determine what kind of attitudes the child is displaying. Same stuff we're seeing rolled out here. They've got microchips now that they put in the children's school uniforms to track where they are at school. They connect with their smartphones and all their data things. And what's happening with all this data is they're perfecting the manipulation, right? They're figuring out, okay, well, this child has resisted our indoctrination on this program. Let's figure out what works. And then the algorithms figure it out. The artificial intelligence figures it out. And then they know, all right, anytime we run into this sort of resistance to our ideological indoctrination program, this is the appropriate remedy. And this is all now happening within the computer system, right? The teacher just gets the instructions. It's like far worse than any nightmare that George Orwell of 1984 ever could have imagined, because he just couldn't have conceived of this technology that exists now. But that's where we're headed. And the same type of stuff is coming in America. I mean, these headbands that they're putting on the kids now was actually developed by a company in Massachusetts, and they rolled it out in a school in Boston. So
I did not know it had come to America.
Yep, it's here,
I
just
figured
in pilot programs and
it had
stuff.
already come.
Yeah, I mean, it's not wide. These brain scanning headbands are not widespread yet, but they will be if we continue down this path. So
maybe eventually they'll include electroshock.
Yeah, right. You start dozing off, bzz, right? You start being intolerant to the drag queen. Bzz, right? Crazy.
All right, well, I guess we'll have to close now. Thank you, Alex. This has been an honor. I could sit and listen to you all day, but thank you for the honor of being able to interview you and talk about this very important subject.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Ivan. It's been an honor to be here. Hopefully this will be a good tool for the local members there in North Carolina. Really rooting for you guys. It's so important that people get involved in the Birch Society, and we have got to turn this mess around. We've got to protect our children. We've got to educate our adults if we want to keep our freedom in our nation. So thank you again, Ivan, for allowing me the honor of speaking, and God bless you all.
God bless you. All right.